Okay. What we're going to talk about has to do with labor market interactions. So up to this point, we've talked about goods markets. So talking about, price and quantity for marijuana or kidneys or, beer or whatever else it is that we're talking about. But now we're going to switch from the consumption side of things to the production side of things and think about factors and resources rather than just goods. So first we're going to set up a labor market model. And then specifically, we're going to try to understand the source of wage differences. Why do some people earn more than others? What are the different factors that affect wages? And not surprisingly, this is going to have a lot to do with what we'd already talked about a second ago, which is supply and demand. And somehow, I grabbed my bottle of water and didn't make it down. So I may need to run out and grab some water in the middle of this because I'll damage my voice if I don't. Anyway, so we're going to do a little discussion of wage differences, and then finally, we're going to talk about discrimination and supply and demand, specifically with wages. Now, labor market model is going to give us the basics. Then we're going to talk a little bit about some data, and then we're going to apply that labor market model again to understand a specific market where you see very large differences in pay that may or may not be due to discrimination. We'll talk about the sources of those differences in pay. So the first thing is just setting up this model of the labor market. So it's going to be very much very similar to what we've seen before in terms of what we had with the goods market, where on the y-axis, we're going to have some sort of price. On the x-axis, we're going to have a measure of quantity. So what is the price of labor, of workers?
Wage.
The wage rate, right. So we're going to have the wage on the y-axis, and we can do that in terms of dollars per unit of labor. And units of labor can be in different forms. We can say this in terms of dollars per hour or dollars per year, whatever it might be. Dollars per week is a measure that we're going to talk about in just a second. So our wage is our price, and that's on the y-axis. And on the quantity side of things, we can just talk about the number of workers. Likewise, if we wanted to, we could have this in terms of some sort of worker input level, like we could talk about hours of labor. We could talk about worker hours, some sort of aggregation between not just an individual worker or the number of workers, but kind of like all together, the number of workers, the number of hours per worker somehow combined. We can just do this in terms of the number of workers, then that's fine. Not surprisingly, what do you think supply curve is going to look like? So as the wage rate increases, how many more people are going to be willing to work? Are there going to be fewer or more? More. So we would describe the supply curve as being increasing or upward sloping, right? So we have an upward sloping supply curve, and we'll just label that as LS for labor supply. Now, why is it at a higher wage more people would be willing to work? What's the story that we have there, Nicholas?
They make more money.
They make more money, right? But you make more money, maybe you don't want to work as hard, right? Because you have more money, right? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, I guess if you won the lottery.
You won the lottery, then you have a lot of money. Now, that's not off of earnings, right? That's income that's unearned in some ways because we think about earnings as being from your labor. But I mean, one story would be maybe at a high enough wage, you would only work 30 hours a week rather than 40 hours a week or something like that because you've had all your needs met or something like that. But generally, we think of overall for society like the number of workers is going to increase because what's going to happen at low wages? What will people decide to do instead of working? What could you do instead?
Be lazy?
You could be lazy, right? Are you being lazy right now?
No.
So what could you do instead of going out in the job market?
Well, like right now, currently, I got a paper I need to finish.
Right, so you would be,
So I would probably be working on that.
so one thing is you might go to school instead, right? If the job market's really crappy, what happened in 09 through like 2008 through 2010, the number of students increased pretty dramatically because it's like, well, I know there aren't any jobs out there, so I might as well go back to school for a little while, right? So at low wages, you'd expect the number of workers to be lower because they have fewer opportunities out there. And likewise, at high wages, people decide to maybe leave school early, or they won't go and get an extra degree because they know that the jobs are pretty good out there. And we'll talk about an example of that in just a little bit. But the basic idea here is that as the opportunity cost of not working increases, then more people are going to work, right? So at a higher wage, the amount of money and the stuff you're giving up by not working gets higher, so you'd rather be working than not working. It's the basic story. Now we can do this also in terms of a specific model, in terms of a specific market. We can do this in terms of, let's say, the market for academics, which we're going to talk about in a second, or the market for custodians, or whatever else we want to do. Now, labor demand curve is downward sloping. Any ideas about this?
Well, I don't want to pay too many people a high wage.
Right, so at lower wages, you could substitute between capital and labor. You could use fewer machines and more workers. At a higher wage, you might use more machines and fewer workers. Likewise, at a low wage, you might be able to produce more stuff and still make a profit because you don't have to pay your workers very much. And so you might want more of them if it's a fairly low wage, right? So labor demand curves slope down just like demand curves for products. So that's our basic model, and the intersection of supply and demand would lead to an equilibrium wage and an equilibrium number of workers. We'll have that as L for the number of workers in equilibrium, and W, we can just put little stars on there to indicate equilibrium. We'll do a couple more analyses with this besides the one that we're going to do today a little bit later in class when we talk about minimum wage laws and stuff like that. Right? Questions about this? Now, let's think about things that would increase the demand for labor. Why might a company all of a sudden decide to want more workers at any given wage?
Demand for the product.
Demand for the product, exactly. So the idea is that labor demand is a derived demand. It's derived from the demand for the product. If people don't want your product, you don't need any workers to produce it, right? The more demand for the product, the higher demand for workers. Likewise, you might have other things like the cost of other resources changing. So if capital gets really expensive, like it's really expensive to take out a loan to build a new factory, then maybe you'd want more workers because you can't afford to borrow money to build the factory or to buy a new machine or land or whatever else it is. Likewise, you might, let's see, what else could happen here? If all of a sudden there was a change in the characteristics of the labor, maybe you'd want more labor because of that. Like if labor were somehow more productive, then that would also increase the demand for that labor, right? So part of the idea is when states want to invest in education, they want to do so because they see it as a good way of attracting businesses to increase the demand for their labor, decrease unemployment, etc. Right. How about labor supply? Well, the main thing that shifts labor supply are other opportunities, right? So if this is talking about a particular market, if the wage increases in some other market that you could supply your labor to, then you'd expect to shift to the left of the labor supply curve. If the opportunities in another market decrease, it'd be a shift to the right of the labor supply curve. All right. Let's talk about the nuts and bolts of this stuff then and talk about what actual wages look like. And I'll do this based upon a couple different categories. First, let's look at wages based upon education level. Last time we talked about education and the importance of it in terms of a positive externality, but we can also talk about it in terms of the returns to the individual. All right. So these are median weekly wages. Median is just describing the middle point Oftentimes when you talk about income and wages, it's useful to use medians rather than means to talk about the average amount, because the problem with wages is there's a hard bottom, right? What's the minimum amount that a wage can go to?
Is it like 5 or 7?
It's $7.25 is officially the minimum wage, but we know that even if we want to pay people less, we can't pay them less than 0, right? But in terms of the highest wage, we can think about the CEOs of huge companies getting paid literally, thousands of dollars an hour for their work, which would mean that you have this really weird distribution where you have, 0 is being really close to the average, the median, but then you have a lot of people that can also earn a lot more than that. So you get this weird distribution. So median is a better average measure than mean, or what we typically think of as the average. So let's think about two different measures of labor market, two different kinds of labor market outcomes. We have unemployment and then wages. And we'll have this by educational category. So we'll start off with high school dropouts. And the data I'm looking at is a couple years old, but I think it's useful. It's still pretty relevant, and we can update the data. In 2013, the unemployment rate was 7.5% nationally for high school dropouts, and average weekly wages was $651. Oh, sorry, that's not a high school dropout, that's a high school diploma. Sorry. Not reading my abbreviations correctly. If you had some college, unemployment rate was 7.0%, and 727 was the median wage. If you had an associate's degree, 5.4%, and $770. A bachelor's degree, down to 4%, and a little over 1,100. A master's, 1329. Sorry, the wrong column there. 4% is that one, and so this one is 3.4%, 1329, and a PhD, 2.2% for the unemployment rate, and 1623 for.
So the more education you have, the lower the unemployment rate.
So the more education you have is associated with a lower unemployment rate and a higher wage, right? So the question is does education pay in some way?
Yes.
Right? It pays. Now, we could do a cost-benefit analysis here and look at the difference between a wage for a high school diploma versus a wage for someone with a bachelor's degree. And just based upon these medians, right, this is about $450 more for the bachelor's, and that ends up being about an 80% premium, about 70-80% premium if you just compare those two things. Do that calculation over a lifetime, generally a college degree will earn you about $1 million more over a lifetime. Right? Does that sound like it's worth it?
And if you factor in student loans.
Okay, so student loans, are you going to pull out $1 million in student loans? No, and it also depends on where you are in the distribution, right? So this may be a skewed distribution in some ways, where some people don't earn any more than what they would have earned with a high school degree, while some people earn a lot more. So you'd have to understand like where you are in the distribution too, right? Just understanding that number isn't enough, but if you kind of looked at the different points of the distribution, you'd get an idea that for most people, getting a college degree pays for itself. Maybe not in the first 5 years, but over the entire 30 years of working, it's going to pay for itself. Now, the question becomes then why are these numbers like this? Why is it that people with a bachelor's degree earn more than people with a high school degree? High school only degree. What do you think? Yeah.
People want to hire people with higher education.
People want to hire people with a higher education, but why? Like, think about it in terms of like labor demand, labor supply. More education, you'd expect them to be what?
Smart. smart, intelligent.
Smarter, intelligent, but why would I want a smarter worker rather than a dumber worker?
Because you got less accidents from somebody being a complete idiot.
You're right. So if you're on a shop floor, you're someone with fewer accidents. Likewise, even if you're in the service industry, right? What are you hoping that people are going to be able to be, speak clearly to your customers, if they're going to be able to be understood, make logical arguments, use critical thinking, all those sorts of things, make the company more productive. And if the company's more productive, then guess what? Their profits are higher with a more educated worker than they would be with a lower educated worker. You can hire a lower educated worker for less, but you're going to want to hire the more educated one because they're going to add more to your productivity and your profitability than the lower educated one.
Could it also be because they could switch out different positions? Like, for example, if somebody went to school to be a historian and a Spanish, major at the same time, double major, then they could teach both history and Spanish in high school. Therefore, somebody who just majored in history would be seeing better because now you can not have to hire twice as many teachers.
Right. I mean, you still have to have teachers for every single class, right? But the more credentials and the more skills you get, generally you're trying to improve your overall marketability. And the more diverse skill set you have as someone who's going into teaching or going into whatever else, they're going to be more marketable, right? And this is the basic idea behind this, is that human capital is what largely drives wages. Your investments in your own skill set will make you more productive for an employer, and therefore you're going to be a more attractive candidate for a job, and therefore you're going to be more likely to be hired, not be unemployed. And when you get hired, you're more likely to be rewarded for this by getting higher wages. So this is correlated to that. And we can see, okay, if someone with an associate's degree is going to have more skills than someone with a high school degree only, bachelor's likewise. But what about this just being a sorting mechanism then? Are you guys exactly the same as the people that you went to high school with that didn't go on to college or that even dropped out of high school? Do you think that you're just as productive of a worker as someone that that went to high school but didn't ever go to college? No? Do you think you're better?
Lazy.
You
They're
think-
kind of lazy. I'm sorry, but being truth be told, my
I think,
best friend is lazy, and
I think I would be less productive in a manual labor position than
Okay.
someone who that's what they wanted to do.
Okay, so maybe in particular jobs, there's a difference between the individuals. Okay. But part of the story that economists like to tell of this is that some of it has to do with human capital and productivity, but some of it may also be sorting, right? Where more productive workers are more likely to be willing to go to college and take that risky investment because they believe in themselves and they know they're not lazy. They know they can get through college and get that degree to get the better job. While less productive workers won't even go on to college because they expect to fail because they haven't been good at doing these sorts of things in the past. So maybe part of what's going on isn't that as you add college, you're adding more productivity, but you're just sorting people into lower productivity workers and higher productivity workers, and that's what college is doing. I don't like that story because it means that everything I do in terms of teaching people is worthless, right? I'm trying to make you more productive, at least by increasing your critical thinking skills, so I don't like that story entirely. I think there may be some of that going on, but that's not entirely the story. I think you are actually becoming better critical thinkers, better problem solvers, etc., by actually going to college. Better writers, better speakers, all those things. Okay. So that's our story about education. When we break this down into demographic characteristics in terms of race, ethnicity, and gender, it gets a little bit trickier though. So let's talk a little bit about that. So we'll have race/ethnicity in this column. We'll have men and women, and then we'll have, this all will be weekly wages. And we'll again have, we'll have, this is all will be weekly wages. And we'll again have, this is all will be weekly wages. And we'll again have, this is all will be weekly wages. And we'll again have, this is all will be weekly wages. And we'll again have, this is all will be weekly wages. And we'll again have, this is all will be weekly wages. And we'll again have, this is all will be weekly wages. And we'll again have, this is all will be weekly wages. And we'll again have, this is all will be weekly wages. And we'll again have, this is all will be weekly wages. And we'll again have, this is all will be weekly wages. And we'll again have, this is all will be weekly wages. And we'll again have, this is all will be weekly wages. And we'll again have, this is all will be weekly wages. And we'll again have, this is all will be weekly wages. And we'll again have, this is all will be weekly wages. And we'll again have, this is all will be weekly wages. And we'll again have, this is all will be weekly wages. And we'll again have, this is all will be weekly wages. And we'll again have, this is all will be weekly wages we'll again have this difference in median weekly wages. All right. So for white men, so what, white, median weekly wage of $9.69. For women, $7.74. For black, $7.32 and $6.54. For Asian, so higher or lower than these two categories?
Higher.
Higher than both?
I think so.
Pretty dramatically, and we'll talk a little bit about the reason for that in just a second. And finally, Hispanic is our last category. All right. So if we just wanted to sort these different groups, right? So who has the highest wages for both men and women? Asian. Next highest is going to be white. Third highest will be black. And then lowest is going to be Hispanic. Okay. Now, does our story about human capital fully capture these wage differences? All right. So what's true about educational attainment with these different categories? Who has the highest educational attainment? Asians do have the highest educational attainment, and that explains a lot of what this is here, right? It would be very hard to tell a discrimination story where all of a sudden, the predominant culture, like, white men in American society want to pay Asians more for doing the same work, right? It doesn't make much sense, right? So this is largely because there are educational differences and they're the most educated. In terms of black and white differences, there is some educational differences, but what's interesting is that then when you break it down between women and men, who has more education in the black community, women or men? Women do. Women are actually getting more college degrees right now than men are in the African American community. So that's not explaining that difference there. And likewise, we can explain some of the Asian difference that way and some of the white difference that way, but it definitely doesn't explain what's going on with black men and black women. Now, whites are lower than Asian in here, and part of it has to do with a bit of bias in these numbers. What's true about Hispanics? Is Hispanic a race or an ethnicity? It's an ethnicity, and you can be white Hispanic or non-white Hispanic, and you can be white non-Hispanic, right? So whites will include both Hispanics and non-Hispanics. In some of the numbers, I think in the textbook, they break it out by non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic whites, and those numbers will be a little bit higher because most of the Hispanics in America are white by definition, right? You have some black Hispanics as well, particularly from Dominican Republic. So that's part of the lowering of these numbers is because you're mixing in Hispanic. Now, why are Hispanics so much lower than everybody else? Partially it's education, right? But also, what is it?
Because Latin America has always been low funded and stuff.
Right, but this includes people that were born here, right? But it also includes a lot of fairly recent immigrants, right? And recent immigrants are not going to have the language skills, they're not going to have the education and other things, such that they're not going to be quite as high as some of these other groups, right? Now, to what degree is some of this discrimination? Economists use pretty sophisticated econometric techniques using lots of data sets. And they find that there is some discrimination here, right? That some of this has to do with the fact that some white employers don't hire blacks even with the same credentials, and they won't pay them as much as well. But what's interesting is that let's just focus on the difference between white men and white women. What's true about these two different groups in terms of the kinds of jobs that they hold? Do they hold the exact same kinds of jobs?
Well, not necessarily because women are like treasurers, secretaries. Men actually do the hard work, the hard labor.
Well, I'm not going to claim that. I'll let you say that.
Like, you see what I'm saying though? So, like,
right. So think about two jobs that a high school graduate or a high school dropout even would have that would be different between men and women. So a man might get what kind of job?
Like maybe like an architect or something.
Well, not if they're a high school dropout, right? You're not going to be going there.
Yeah.
Like a cook.
They might be a cook, okay?
Yeah.
Might be a cook, might be a construction worker, right? something like that. How about a woman that's a high school dropout? What kind of job might she have?
Cashier.
Might work at Sanderson Farms or something.
It might be cashier, might be Sanderson Farms, like daycare service industry. Some more of the hospitality industry. And even if you think about people with college degrees, predominantly, are there more men or women at USM? There are more women. It's about 68% women actually here. It's more than 2 to 1. Part of the reason why is what are two of our biggest programs in terms of in terms of colleges and programs? Nursing and education, right? Predominantly K through 12 teachers are still female, predominantly nurses are still female, and both of those get paid less than occupations that are more male dominated. Now, is that because they're actually less productive, or is there some sort of occupational crowding? Make sure to read through those different theories in your textbook because there is some contention there. But what's interesting is that if you take white men and white women with a college degree that are single and don't have kids earn nearly the exact same amount as white men with a college degree that are single as well, right? One of the big hits on women is that they often don't have the same number of years of experience at any age. So if you take a 35-year-old man and a 35-year-old woman, the 35-year-old woman generally has fewer years of experience in the labor market. And why is that? Children. Like, it is much more common for women to take some time out of the labor market, even be that 18 months or even 6 months, than it is for men to do so. And one of the problems that we have in America is because we don't have a good federal system of supported maternity leave, that those women often will have to leave their jobs and then start anew. And every time you start a new job, after you've left a job, you start off closer to the bottom than at the top, right? You don't come in at the same wage rate you usually left at. And so if you have to take that step down, then you have this problem. In European countries, this wage gap is much smaller, oftentimes because there's a better system. There's a more generous system for maternity benefits. So in like Scandinavian countries, you'll get 14, 15 months of maternity benefits, while in the U.S. we get how much federally? 12 weeks of unpaid leave. That's the most you can get and still keep your job, right? So federally, you can take out just 12 weeks of unpaid leave, but that's it. And it has to be unpaid. Right? So very different systems in terms of generosity of maternity benefits, which drive some of this. Now, there are educational differences. There is some discrimination here, and there's some occupational sorting. All that sort of stuff is happening. But one of the things that I want everyone who studies, takes at least an Eco 101 class to say is that if you just look at wage differences, that doesn't necessarily mean discrimination. Wage differences are determined by lots of different things, human capital differences, occupational sorting, other things like that. And just because there's a difference doesn't mean there's discrimination. Discrimination means that there's someone who's using some sort of characteristic to pay one person more than someone else, rather than just productivity differences. And the example that I'd like to use to highlight that is going to come from academia, and that's what we'll do next.
So will a doctor be one and like a nurse?
Right, so if you have occupational sorting, where more men go on to become doctors and more women become nurses, then you're going to get very big differences in pay, right? And it's not like women are discouraged from going to become doctors, like in any overt way, but maybe there are subtle, like cultural clues or cultural cues in other ways that women are raised differently than men, such that they're not encouraged to go into those fields that are higher pay as well. So there's a lot of stuff that's bundled in there that we can't just say, well, it's because they're discriminated against. There's a lot of stuff that goes into that too. And one of the things we talked about last time, you want to talk about, racial differences in pay. Talk about public schooling and private schooling. In general, if whites have been earning more, they're also going to be the ones that are more likely to, disproportionately able to afford better schools, move into better neighborhoods that have better schools, all those sorts of things. So it kind of feeds on itself as well. Now what I'd like to do is talk about the example between economists and sociologists. So I'm the chair of not the chair of the economics department. We don't have an economics department. I'm chair of the political science department. And we're in the middle of hiring 4 people. I've made offers to 2 political scientists. I've made offers to 2 economists. the amount of money that we've offered them is very, very different, even though they're all going to be professors, even in the same department. There's actually a book over in the library that has all the salaries of everybody that works at the university, and you can see this sort of stuff for yourself. Right? That this is public knowledge because we're a public institution. At the University of Virginia, they've published all this stuff in their daily newspaper called the Daily Cavalier. And you'll see that oftentimes an economist at the same level as a sociologist may earn $95,000 a year, while the sociologist would only earn $55,000 or $60,000 a year. Exact same teaching load, exact same research expectations, and everything else. And so the question that I have, kind of the economic puzzle, is what causes this difference in pay?
There's more sociology majors than econ majors.
There may be more, that's part of it as well. Yeah, that's going to be part of it. But there's other dynamics that go into this as well. How about this? This is for brand new. So this is for a new PhD. If you look at someone that's been around for 25 years, that's at the associate professor level. So this is someone who was promoted once and not promoted again. In econ, they're earning about $65,000. In Soc, they're earning about $65,000. So at some point, they were earning about the same, and they've just kind of gotten some raises over the years. But recently, for brand new people that are being hired in the last 5 or 10 years, you're getting this really big difference in pay. And so the question is, can we use labor supply and labor demand models to explain why? Now, what's interesting is that sociologists study oftentimes very similar things that economists do. We were just talking in a previous class about how there's a branch within economics where it actually more heavily influences sociology than influences economics. But like I study labor markets, right? Sociologists study labor markets as well. They talk about poverty and discrimination, migration, all these things. They just talk about it with using different tools and different approaches. But what I'd like to do is use this labor supply and labor demand model to talk about where did these wage differences come from. So we have wages for economists and wages for sociologists. So what I've done is I've drawn a supply curve and demand curve for each of the two markets. So this is all for academic economists, so people working inside academia, so working in universities, colleges, etc. And this is for academic sociologists, again, working for universities, colleges, etc. And I'm going to start off with the idea that in 1985, so it's LD 85, LS 85, LS 85, LD 85, that they're earning approximately the same amount. And we see this through the evidence that if these people that have been about in the same rank for the last 20, 25 years are earning about the same. All right, is everyone with me? That the equilibrium wage starting in 1985 was about the same. That when they were first hired, they were getting about the same. Now we know that the wage for economists is much higher, for brand new economists. Now the question is why is this? Is it because of labor supply or is it because of labor demand? And is it the same case for sociologists? Is something going on with labor supply and labor demand?
I don't know, you'd think there would be a bigger demand for sociologists because there's more students that are, that want to go into that. It's an easier science. But I would still think that there's a greater thing in labor supply on the economist side.
Okay, so you're thinking that somehow the labor supply curve would have to shift left or right over here?
Left.
It'd have to shift left, yeah.
I'm confused.
Okay, about what?
I don't know.
Okay. Can you ask a specific question?
Like when you were saying, okay, you said they the same.
back in 1985.
Okay.
So we've kind of like jumped in the time machine and we're back in 1985. And at this point, this is what labor supply and labor demand look like in these two markets, because we know that what's happened is that those people, so the way academia works is this. You start off, if you have a PhD and you start a new job at a university, you start off as an assistant professor. Then after 6 years of assistant professor, you're given the option, the university is given the option of either tenuring and promoting you, or you get kicked out and you have to find a new job somewhere else. So if you get promoted once, you become an associate professor. If after 5 or 6 years you've also done good things, that you've been really productive in terms of your research, you've brought in grants, you're teaching great classes, all those sorts of things, then they'll promote you to full professor. So someone who's been around for 25 years and is an associate professor, that means that they must have done enough to not get fired, but then they've basically done nothing in the last 20 years. Okay? And it's not that they've done nothing, but they just haven't been very productive researchers. They know the university knows that they can't get jobs somewhere else, so there's no reason to give them a big wage increase, right? There's no reason to give them a big raise. And so using the evidence that we have from this Cavalier Daily, we understand that this is what the market must have looked like back in 1985. Because we have these people that have been in the system for 25, 30 years that basically are earning the same thing today. So this is what it must have looked like. But today we know that the wage is much higher for economists compared to sociologists. And so one thing that might have happened is labor supply could have shifted to the left. All right. So what could possibly happen there? So let's go ahead and draw that in. And we'll say that this is labor supply in 2015. Okay.
Because, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, like, in 1985, the economy didn't suck as bad as it does now. In a
1980.
recession,
And we're not in a recession. We're, unemployment is, below 6% now. 1985. What do you guys think about 1985? Any images of this?
Reagan.
Reagan, right? So this was right at the beginning of the Reagan boom, right? Because you had a big recession, kind of 81, 82, another one into 83.
When was the stock market crash? Was that
87.
87.
Okay. After 87, what ends up happening is we start getting a very strong period of growth in the economy. So it started in 88, 89. We had a little dip in 90, 91, and then it started growing really strongly during the 1990s. One thing that's going to decrease labor supply into academia is where could they go besides academia? If you're not going into teaching at a university, who might hire a PhD in economics?
Any major
The government might do so, right? What else?
private industry.
Private industry might do so. Why does private industry want them?
I guess to analyze current prices. Or
To figure out strategies to understand how to price, whether or not to merge, what's going to be the effect on the market for merging. Like one of my interviews, I studied Palestinian labor economics, right? So this is very much a weird applied sort of subject that doesn't have much to do with business at all. In 1999, I got an interview with Arthur Andersen in Chicago, right, to understand transfer pricing, which is the way you price a good within a big corporation when you're selling it from one part of the company to another part of the company. That's what they were interviewing me for a job doing that. I didn't know jack shit about that, right? I mean, I'm studying Palestinian labor market, but they're so desperate for anyone who could run regressions and do statistics and understand markets in any way that they're willing to fly me up to Chicago, put me up at the Palmer House Hilton, all this sort of stuff, because they were so desperate. I mean, I ended up not, taking the job, thank goodness, because they were part of the Enron scandal and ended up collapsing 2 years later. But nonetheless, they're so desperate that they're throwing all sorts of money towards recent PhDs with quantitative skills. The government became much more quantitative based, so they started hiring more economists. Wall Street started hiring them. Banks and businesses and industry all over the place started hiring them and offering much higher wages, which meant that the supply to academia shifted to the left. It wasn't the only place to get a job. Wall Street wanted them too, so that shifted to the left. Okay. Now, that's part of the reason. To create a PhD in economics, what else do you need? Who do you need to actually get the PhD in economics? Well, generally you need people to go to grad school first, right? Who's going to go to grad school in economics? Generally, what are their majors going to be like in undergrad? Economics, right? That'd be a good place. what was happening when 2 years before or 2 years after I got that offer, I was teaching in a small liberal arts college in Ohio, and I had these students that'd be like, hey, you're really smart. You should go on and study economics in grad school. And they're like, yeah, I thought about it, but I did this internship on Wall Street this summer, and this is like October. And they're like, and that place has already offered me a job starting at $150,000 a year. I said, yeah, that's a good reason not to be a grad student for the next 5 or 6 years and eat ramen noodles. That's a really good reason not to pursue your PhD in economics, is because you can automatically go out with a bachelor's degree and earn 6 figures. So when you have that going on, that's also going to dry up the market for people potentially going into academia. So both for undergrad and graduate level economists, the market was booming outside of academia, which shifts the supply curve to the left. So the increase in non-academic demand is going to shift the supply curve to the left. Now, what do you think about with the 80s in terms of American culture and business and society? Is there a movie that's associated with the 80s that you can think of?
Is it Wall Street, Money Never Sleeps?
Yeah, so Wall Street, right? So at the time, Wall Street had gone from this kind of like, this very much not the most positive influence in society in terms of like people didn't really think about it as a career. People weren't interested in being business people. Think about the difference between the movie Wall Street and the movie Dazed and Confused. Has anyone seen that? With Matthew McConaughey, right? Was everyone really interested in going out and making money in the 1970s? Is that what it was all about? No, they just want to chill out, it's just like hang out, be with friends, smoke a lot of weed. That's what the 70s were about. 80s, all of a sudden, though, you have Family Ties. Right? You guys ever watch Family Ties? All right. Family Ties is a very popular sitcom in the 1980s, and it had Alex Keaton as this young Republican in the 1980s that was all about, going out and earning money and going on to Wall Street and getting a good job. And the 80s were very much driven by, like, people wanting to go out there and get that good job. So what happened to the demand for business majors, or the number of business majors since the 1980s?
Sure, it's going up.
It's gone up. Who has to teach those business majors principles of micro and principles of macro? Economists do, right? So as the demand for business degrees has increased, guess what? So is the demand for academic economists. So we might have gotten more of a supply shift and demand shift, more of a demand shift than a supply shift, but regardless, both of those factors will cause the wage to increase. So you see the wage from 1985 to 2015 going up dramatically. How about sociology? Where do they get jobs? Academia and sometimes nonprofit sector, right? I mean, they'll get jobs, but they're generally, like sociology for an undergrad, one of the most common fields to go into is social work, right? Social workers are not paid very well, not compared to getting a job on Wall Street, right? So if you think about the world where social work is a big deal versus the one where getting paid on Wall Street as a quant is a big deal, it's a huge difference in the market. So these people aren't demanded by Wall Street, right? And they're also not demanded that much more by academia because as people have shifted their values towards more making money, these business majors are people that might have been sociology majors back in the day. So sociology as a major has gotten smaller in the past 30 years rather than larger. So because neither demand nor supply has really increased, and if anything, it might have actually decreased a little bit, then we don't get that wage change going on with sociology. Now, here's a question. What gender are most economists?
Me or male?
Male. And it's actually about 2 to 1 or 3 to 1. Between 25 and 30% of economists are female, PhD economists. Okay. Sociology,
Probably female.
it's slightly more female, and actually here they have a real trouble. They have one male sociologist right now. And they hired another sociologist here, another female. So they have the problem of way too many females, and it's actually biased towards women. So what happens when you look at gender differences in pay? And if you say, okay, these two people both have PhDs, who's going to earn more money? On average, men are, because they're going to be more in the technical fields that have a higher demand in industry, and women are going to be in the fields that are less demanded by industry, just because of whatever drew them to sociology in the first place and what drew people to economics in the first place, having nothing to do with discrimination. But there's a gender difference in pay still. Now, whether or not there's some pre-market discrimination in terms of the kinds of education people are getting, maybe women are pushed away from more technical fields in the first place, maybe that's part of it as well. But that's not labor market discrimination, that's pre-market discrimination. So the big thing to take away from this is never look at wage differences and assume that all of the wage difference is discrimination. Some of it may be, but just because people get paid differently doesn't mean they're being discriminated against. All right. We'll talk more about discrimination policies and law next time, and then we'll start talking about poverty as well.